Welcome once again to Christians in Media's podcast. This is Faith in Media with me, Carla, your host, and we are delighted to have Julia Bicknell joining us today in our conversation. Julia, welcome to Faith in Media. This is amazing to have you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Carla. So I've been doing well recently. So a little bit about me. I joined the BBC as a graduate trainee at the age of 21. I worked on the BBC staff for over 30 years, roughly 15 years in radio, and then roughly 7 years in television. And then the last 7 years or so, I trained journalists around the world, particularly in developing countries. So they were in countries like Kenya, Somalia, Nigeria, obviously, as you noticed there, Africa. But I also worked in Pakistan as a BBC stringer, as they call the sort of foreign reporters. Lived in Pakistan for a year, reported from both Pakistan and Afghanistan in that year, and actually from Delhi. And I also spent 6 months living and working in Vietnam. And that was also for a BBC project, which was, I was a kind of sent to work with the national radio station, the Voice of Vietnam. And then the last 10 years or so, after I left the BBC in 2012, I have focused on reporting the global church under pressure for its faith. Some people might describe it as persecuted Christians, but I actually prefer to use that language. And now, for the last year or so, I have gone freelance, completely freelance, and I do a mixture of coaching and consulting and writing, editing, managing projects, managing events, a real variety, but all where I believe I can add kind of special, unique value from my background, from my experience to what I'm doing.
That is incredible, Julia. It is an honor to have someone with such an extensive background as yourself here today. And I can't wait to kind of unpack that a little bit as we enjoy today's conversation. But I do like to start with a little bit of an icebreaker, just to have a little bit of fun and to get it warming.
Okay.
So I'm just going to hit it with you now and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
If you were to have, as you know, we have 24 hours a day. If you were to have 25 hours a day, how would you spend the extra time?
Whoa, what a good question. I think my honest answer right now is just reading. I think the thing that is missing from my sort of 24 hours at the moment is just that time to read books and also actually listen to podcasts. Those are things that I find myself endlessly trying to catch up with. So I've actually got about 3 books on the go at the moment, but not quite finding the space to finish, any one of those 3. I've got about another 3 that I desperately want to get going on, and I've got a list of podcasts that I want to catch up on that somehow I never quite manage. So that would be my extra hour.
I love that you said that. I think that's so true. For me personally, I feel like even in the last 10, 15 years, it feels like this world has just got very fast, maybe perhaps a bit too fast for me, to the point where I don't feel like I always have enough time in the day to do things like reading. My first degree is in English, and I just remember literally consuming books by literally the day, which was part of the course. But in terms of the reading for pleasure and enjoyment and just enrichment, sometimes I feel like I miss that so much. But life has just become so busy. And also with the digital era, people find themselves more on screens and devices rather than picking up a good old fashioned book. So I love that that's your choice of things. I think I would be a little bit like you in trying to fit it with those kind of endeavors. That's amazing. So you've mentioned in your introduction, which is so incredible and very inspirational, an extensive span of career within working in the BBC and in the media. What led you to pursuing a career within that space? And tell us a bit about the journey of how you got there in the first place.
Oh my goodness. Well, when I was about 12 years old, I had this kind of thing that I wanted to do, and it went something along these lines. I realized that if you give people the right information and all the relevant information, then they can wise wise decisions. If they don't have all the right if they only have part of the information, or they have irrelevant information, then they can't make those wise decisions because they don't have
Right.
all the data. And
Mm.
if people in the world make wise decisions, then that makes the world a better place. That was my kind of summing up. And what do you do with that if you kind of figure that out? Well, you become a journalist because you want to find out the right information, and you want to give people all the information, and you want to help people to make wise decisions. So along the way, I did sort of toy with the idea of doing law, but I spent half a day in the Winchester Crown Court, and I decided that law was a bit too slow for me. I wanted a bit more action, a bit more variety and pace. The other thing that was a kind of a bit of a giveaway was my dad always used to complain from when I was a very young age. The trouble with you, Julia, is you always want to know the far end of Meg and how far to it. In other words, I was always asking questions, and whatever my dad told me, I would then ask another question. And to the point, I used to make myself thoroughly annoying, I think. But the point was, I was always curious. I always wanted to know. I always wanted to get all the information. And I still find that today. I still find if people give me part of the answer, but not the whole answer, I get deeply frustrated, annoyed, and sort of think, why did they not answer that particular part of my question? So there you go. That was kind of a bit of an obvious, perhaps, career choice. I have to say, I'm talking many years ago now. It wasn't, there weren't the plethora of media there are today. It was very much, there was the BBC, there was ITV, there wasn't even Channel 4 when I started.
Really?
And so the routes in were quite limited. God absolutely opened the doors in a very clear way, because I had no contacts in the media world. My mum was a nurse, my dad was a policeman. So there was no connection. We didn't live in London. We lived a long way out of London. But God kind of brought people into my life. He connected me with people. And amazingly enough, I went down the road to the local job agency and I said, please, any job, give me any job for 2 weeks. Just need a job to earn some money. And they rang me back the next day. This was when I was literally almost, I think I wasn't even 18, 17.
Wow.
And they said, how would you like to work for the Independent Broadcasting Authority? And it just happened that the IBA had its headquarters in London, opposite Harrods, but they had just moved out to the Hampshire countryside in a little village a few miles from where I was growing up. And they needed clerical staff to go and be sort of admin assistants. And they just happened to ring, or I went in the day they were looking for people. So I turned up at the IBA, met the man who I was going to work for 2 weeks. And he said to me, I married a studio manager from Bush House. Now, I had no clue what a studio manager was. I had no clue what Bush House was. I'd never heard of Bush House. But he explained his wife had joined the BBC World Service, which was based in Bush House. And sure enough, a couple of years, well, that was in my gap year between school and university. And 3 years later, I was at Bristol, and all through my university, I worked on BBC Radio Bristol in my spare time as a student. Every week we had a radio programme that we did on BBC Radio Bristol, done by students, for students, but it wasn't university radio, it was local radio, regional radio. And so with that under my belt, I also managed, again, an amazing story, managed to get a summer holiday job working in radios 1 and 2 in the promotion and presentation department.
Wow.
Again, the Lord opened the doors in an amazing way. Although I did my bit, I walked in off the street to BBC Recruitment one day as I was walking past, and I said, I'm a student, I want a job. Do you ever give students jobs? They said, no, we never take on students, but take this form, fill it out, bring it back. And you probably will I remember them saying, you'll probably never hear from us again. A year later, I was working in an aircraft components factory as a summer holiday job to earn money. And I got a phone call. My mum said, hey, the BBC has phoned up. They want you to go and work for them in this particular department. So, of course, I left the aircraft components immediately and went to work in Radio 1 and 2 promotions. And I was working with all the Radio 1 and 2 DJs, the famous names, Terry Wogan, Jimmy Young, Dave Lee Travis, all of them, and the Tony Blackburn in those days. And I ended up working there for my 2 summer holidays.
Amazing.
And I became known as Rusty, one of them nicknamed me Rusty because of my red hair. And they used to talk
Oh,
about me, part of their sort of patter. They'd say, "Oh, Rusty's come into the studio." And so when I came to my final year, I applied for the graduate entry schemes. And sure enough, I became a studio manager, as my boss had mentioned back in sort of 3 years earlier. So that's how I got in. Yeah, it was amazing because there were I was told there were over 12,000 applicants for 24 places, and I got one of the 24 that year.
It
So
just sounds like it was just reserved very specifically for you, Julia, especially the way that you describe, like, I just turned up and the doors opened. That's and I can't wait to talk about that some more. It sounds like that may be the pattern that you experience what God does in your life. You just turn up and he does it. I cannot wait to hear more about that. You mentioned as well that you have obviously had, I would say this is such a privilege, but to have been able to have worked in so many incredible countries, so many different countries, so very far away from what we have here in the UK. What have been some of your favorite places or nations or cities to work in that you've had in your career so far?
I loved living and working in Hanoi in Vietnam. When I saw the job
Wow.
ad, I read, so the job ad read, can you produce live radio phone-ins? Have you lived and worked abroad? And do you know about reproductive health? And I went, yes, yes, and yes. Not because I knew about reproductive health, because I was a single woman, aged 40 at the time, and I obviously had no personal experience of reproductive health, but I had, along the way, I had actually done a project. Again, it was actually, I did it as a favor for a friend. I edited a kind of an annual report that needed a sort of a journalist touch, and it was all about reproductive health in 5 South Asian countries. And the result of that was I managed to then apply for a scholarship to look at reproductive health in Pakistan under Benazir Bhutto, who was the first woman to be Prime Minister of Pakistan.
Wow.
And I wanted to look at, what difference having a woman Prime Minister in a country like Pakistan had made. And I'd done that research project during the spring of 1991, which is actually the time of the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I had then, because of that report, I had then got to know Pakistan. I traveled all over it. Sorry, I'm sidelining, but I'm explaining how I knew about reproductive health.
That's totally fine. This is
traveled
great.
the length and breadth of Pakistan, learned all about reproductive health in a developing country. So when I saw this ad for a job in Hanoi, the next line said, we need someone to come and work in Hanoi, North Vietnam. And I thought to myself, Vietnam, Hanoi, I have no idea. I couldn't even put a mental image to Hanoi. Nowadays, a lot of people go there as a tourist, as a backpacker. I'm talking 1998. Vietnam had only opened to the outside world about 2 years previously to that. So there were no sort of images, you didn't watch travel log docs on travel channels or whatever. So I had no image of what Hanoi looked like. But I just had this, the way I describe it is God hit me in the solar plexus. And when I read that ad, something kind of hit me and I thought, that's what I'm going to do next. And so and it was quite amazing because at the time I was in the middle of buying and selling a flat. And the last thing on my radar was thinking of going to live and work abroad while I was, doing this. But I just had this gut feeling, this is what I meant to do. So long story short, when I had the job interview and they offered me the post, and they said, I think it was something like, we need you to be there up and running in about 3 weeks from now. And I said, oh my goodness, I'm actually trying to buy a flat. So they said, no, the deadline, you've got to be there by this date. So I dropped buying the flat. I pulled out of the flat that I was buying. I sold my flat that I was then living in, my 1-bed flat. And I remember I was in the departure lounge at Heathrow waiting to board the flight, and I was desperately, again, pre-mobile phones. I was on a payphone in the departure lounge at Heathrow, cancelling my gas bill and my electricity bill, because it had been such a frantic few weeks to pack up a flat,
move your life. Yeah.
my life, get ready for a new life, get my visa, get my, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, I landed in Vietnam. I had nowhere to live. I had to go and flat hunt in Vietnam on my own. I didn't speak a word of Vietnamese. Anyway, it was an amazing time.
Can we just talk about how brave that was? Did that not terrify you? I need to know.
Well, I know the weirdest thing is, I just, the way I had this feeling, it was such a strong, kick in the stomach, as it were. No, that makes it sound painful. It wasn't painful. It was just that gut feel. When people use that phrase, gut,
compelling.
It was compelling. I just thought, this is what I am going to do. Amazing. So because I felt that, and I felt that so strongly out of nowhere, it wasn't like I was looking for an opportunity to go and work abroad. It was nothing. It just suddenly hit me, and I just thought, this is it. I know I'm meant to do this. And the guy, my boss, who at the BBC, he was thrilled because of my particular track record at that point of, I had all the ingredients that he didn't think he would find in one person. So he was very encouraging, and was there back in London, the end of again, pre-mobile phone, very, very, very early days of email and the internet. But he was there in the background, and so I knew him, and my family and friends were very supportive. And so, I just felt this is what I'm meant to do.
And what did you love about just being there in Hanoi?
Well, it was actually because as I said, it was there weren't the number that there were just beginning to be tourists. The main tourists actually were groups of French people, because Hanoi had been a French colony. The interesting thing, the most people we think of, again, I am talking 25 years ago, not a few years ago. So most Vietnamese still didn't really know that much about foreign people from the West. It's much more of a tourist trail thing now. So what I loved about it was the people. We call it the Vietnam War. Of course, when you're there, they call it the American War for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But the other interesting thing is that actually they found the French more difficult to deal with, because they'd had a long colonial history under the French, and to be frank, they hadn't been that well treated. That was actually more that was harder for them than the American War, which had destroyed the country and everything else. But what was interesting was a lot of Americans then felt bad about what they'd done, and so there were quite a few American veterans who used to come in, kind of trying to do
some form of reparation,
trying to do exactly. So I was part of a very small kind of expatriate community, but I loved the food. It's wonderful. It's like the best mix of Chinese, Asian cuisine with the French kind of cuisine.
Interesting. Wow.
So things are beautifully presented. And I loved that. And it's a beautiful country as well. I had a chance to travel.
I am sold. So, I feel like I need to stick Vietnam on the bucket list.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
is amazing.
Yeah.
Did you find, this sounds like the dream. It's a type of travel that people are doing more now. And even the way you've described it, you sound like you were like a daredevil pioneer, doing things that no one else had done before. And also being a woman as well, that wasn't, I imagine, as common to have that kind of opportunity. Just, I'm going into the wilderness effectively, or into the unknown. It wasn't something that is as commonly, I think, encouraged as it is now within this kind of.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It was not so common to have single women traveling. But
Yeah.
that said, I would say that was much more of an issue when I lived and worked in Pakistan for a year,
Okay.
because then and again, very, very different culture, and a Muslim culture, where I honestly felt, especially as a representative of the BBC, this was when I
Yeah.
was working as a BBC journalist, I was honestly treated as an honorary man. So I would turn up at somebody's house with typically a group of men, or with men guides or whatever, and
Interesting.
I would be that they would. I always had to be careful whether they would shake my hand. Many of them did, but there were occasionally people who didn't feel comfortable. So I had to learn to not put my hand out, automatically expecting men to shake my hand. But at the same time, what was interesting, and I'm talking now really 30 years ago, when I was there, unlike the men, I would be typically taken behind into the back room to meet the women who had cooked, because particularly in traditional Pakistani villages and communities, the women don't come out to meet strange, particularly foreign men. And so because I was there, and obviously they could see that I was a woman, they would often say, "Would you like to meet my wife and daughters?" And I would
Wow.
have the privilege of going into the kitchen and
Yeah.
meeting the women who had just prepared and brought out this beautiful meal, but they were
Wow.
not allowed to join us and eat with us. So again, I'm not talking everywhere in Pakistan. I'm talking,
Yes.
the rural areas, the tribal villages, that kind of thing. So that
So
was when it
fascinating to
started.
hear cultural practice that you've had like real first-hand experience about. And I really appreciate how respectfully you're taught this is not a general statement. This is very
Yeah.
specific to certain areas. And you were I think you were unafraid to engage and meet people where they were, and like and see it as an honor and a privilege to be able to be given access in such a way. It's really encouraging to hear that. Did you feel that these experiences kind of changed and developed you along the
Oh,
way?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the story I often tell of Pakistan actually is that I met a Catholic nun, and she invited me to visit the Christian community that she worked with
Wow.
and it was in what the term in Pakistan is Kachiabadi, which means the sort of illegal settlements, where people live where they don't officially have permission to live.
Oh,
And the many of the Christians live in these, kind of informal. Another term that is used is informal settlements. Now, these Christians were, honestly, I have never seen this anywhere else in the world. They were living amongst gravestones in a cemetery. That was
wow.
where they had these kind of, it was like a camp, like an encampment, a bit like a refugee kind of encampment. So tarpaulin sheets to keep out the rain, mothers with lots of small children. The most fascinating thing that amongst these gravestones, they had also managed to sort of erect or take from the electricity poles, they managed to put up sort of a satellite dish. And what was beaming in on the satellite dish, and again, I'm talking the early 90s, was Dallas and Dynasty. So there, these Christian women,
Wow.
Christian minority community was living under tarpaulin sheets in a graveyard, watching how they thought the rest of the world lived in these massive ranches like South Fork Ranch, if you remember what that looks like.
Yes, yes,
And so
yes.
for me, that sort of gave a completely distorted image of the wealth of the rest of the world. And yet that was what they thought everyone else in the world lived like that, with these massive houses. And, the women, remember, they used to wear those massive red padded jackets, padded shoulders.
Shoulder pads, yes.
Yeah, so I could see that from this satellite dish. And for me, that was, talk about globalization. That was a real moment of kind of truth for me, that the rest of the world sees, the image that is coming out, particularly of America, whether they like it or not, whether they want to or not, that is what they're getting. And so, you kind of have to almost do a double take, because you're just thinking, what is this saying to them
Yeah.
about the conditions they live in, the dignity that they have, whatever. So for me, it was a real, all my traveling, all my experiences, were just often amazing opportunities and experiences like that.
I can only imagine. And with experiencing kind of like and seeing very up close hand in spaces where, like Christianity is not the predominant faith there, did you find that your values were kind of challenged in any way, or did it kind of actually enhance your personal faith in terms of what you encountered in spaces like that where Christianity is not the predominant religion here? It's not even a cultural practice that is even, should I say, even embraced by the general society. How did that impact you in any way? And was that a challenge to your values at all?
Well, it made me think, because I have to be honest. Some of my best friends in Pakistan, actually, I met one of them for coffee yesterday morning. He is not a Christian. In fact, he is actually an atheist, which again is not a majority view in Pakistan at all. He became a dear friend and still is a dear friend. And many of my friends in Pakistan were and are Muslims. And I realized that for many of them, they do believe they want to serve God, they want to serve their fellow human beings, and do, they have obviously a different theology and everything else, but they, their hearts are turned to God and they are good people. So, then of course that makes you think, but then at the same time, you can also see the abuse of religion and how religion and sort of religiosity and particularly political religion and politicians use religion to exploit people and to, politicize them, etc., etc. So that did sort of, it was more of an understanding of the way. And to be fair, in other countries, I have experienced corruption amongst Christians, amongst churches. I'm sorry to say, but I've experienced that in Nigeria personally. And so I am not saying, only Christians are the ones that are always the
virtue. They've got it right. Absolutely.
You have cases of corruption and greed and immorality amongst Christians as well. So I realized, there is no such thing as a stereotypical generalization about people or countries or whatever.
It's so good to hear you speak about it, and from your very informed opinion as well, having had the privilege to live side by side in these places, really amongst communities that are so different to what we have here. But also your acknowledgement, like, this is nothing to do with faith. Actually, this is a lot to do with human flaw at the heart of it. And it can exist in every community, including those within the Christian community, if our hearts are not in check and surrendered to God and surrendered to his word and the gift of what salvation is meant to be doing in the transformative power of what Christ has done. So it's refreshing to hear you speak that in quite a balanced way. Would you say that, did it have some form of impact on your personal faith, as you had seen so many different models of just humanity at play in these very diverse cultures at all?
I think what it's given me, and this is what I try to live out now. Now I work very much in the sort of international religious freedom space, for want of a better term, and it's about all faiths and people of no faith working together to respect human dignity, to respect, it's the classic, the golden rule: do as you would be done unto. And, thinking about, would I want someone else to treat my mother in this way, or my family, or my child? And actually, yes, we have, Christ is the only, sinless person who ever lived. And we have a fantastic model of him and his life and his teaching that we can hold. But all of the rest of us Christians are fallible. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are amazing people of other faiths who, do live out their values of respect and human dignity and grace and forgiveness and reconciliation. And we can't be the ones to sort of say, we're the best, we're the only, because we're not. And that comes from, as I said, living and working in many different, cultures where there's different majority faith in at least, 3 different countries that I've lived in, not just worked in, but, spent time living and working and, really being alongside people hour by hour, day by day. So no, but it hasn't, if anything, it's made me more determined to sort of live as Christ lived, and not, not the kind of the way that, my kind of human fallenness would sometimes want me to live.
I really appreciate everything that you said there, and I particularly about, I think, the way that you've described your experiences of having had personal relationships built and connections made with such a variety of diverse groups and communities, of those that don't share your personal faith convictions, but it gave you an opportunity to see that God loves these people too, and whatever his plan is for them, I still have my part to play in being Jesus to them. I may be the Bible that they read. I may be the experience that God chooses to use to get, himself known to them in some way. How has it been, after this incredible and extensive career that you've had with the BBC, occupying these beautiful spaces to do this amazing job, the shift over to what you're doing now? What has that been like for you? Has that been, I don't know, what's that jump been like, really? I don't want to put any nuances that I want to put onto that in terms of how you may respond, but please tell us how that's been for the next season and the next journey for you right now.
Well, I feel like, as I said, with the experience of, now you're going to go off to Vietnam, I've had sort of 2 or 3 key moments similar to that one, actually, where I've just felt God has, sometimes I describe it as tapped me on the shoulder, or given me such a clear, and obviously, as you said a while ago yourself, Carla, it's about being available and showing up and actually taking that risk. And each time of the 3 times, I took a big risk. Very briefly, one time was when I actually ended up taking a year out, a career break from the BBC for 1 year to help launch Premier Radio back in the mid-90s. I actually set up the newsroom, and I became the first ever breakfast show co-presenter on Premier Breakfast. Now that again was very much a sort of a absolutely God-led thing. And then that was really I think the first time. And then there was another time again, which was now 2012. I would say the Vietnam thing was the second time. And then the third time was 2012, London Olympics had just finished. And I left the BBC to focus, as I mentioned earlier, on reporting the global church. And for me, it felt like I'd had the experience, as I told you about, in Pakistan. I'd reported on the situation of Christians in Pakistan, but by and large, the work I was doing was not about the faith angle at all. It was about general news. And then I realized that because I'd been a Christian living in these different contexts, I'd actually gained a kind of an interest and an appreciation of what conditions were like for them, particularly Protestant Christians, say in Vietnam, that many, many people had no idea about. So for me, it was a kind of a natural transition. And when as I said, God tapped me on the shoulder and said, now I want you to take all your background, all your experience, and focus on the global church under pressure for its faith. It just felt like a kind of an obvious next step. Amazing. And then, so I've dedicated the last 10 years to that, really. And then just going freelance a year ago, I felt, again, I'm using all my experience, my background. It feels like I still am at the point where I have a lot to contribute and a lot of experience that I can draw on. And before it gets too sort of dated, or I get, too out of touch, I just want to use that. And so it just feels like a natural extension. At the same time, I think in some ways travel has got easier, but in other ways it's got more difficult, because obviously, things like COVID, things like getting visas, particularly as a journalist, has often become a lot harder because governments are much more wary of you and what you're trying to do, what you're trying to report. So, and I don't feel, I feel like I've seen a lot of the world. I've lived in other countries. So, and the wonderful advance of things like Zoom, digital technology, WhatsApp, Signal, I can do a lot of my work from this room, from this very small, tiny, kind of spare bedroom, as it were.
Where all the magic is happening, really.
Yeah, but I've got the contacts, I've got the experience, I've got the the connections. So that's what I do. It sort of feels, in a way, just people use the phrase giving back. I feel like now's the time to give back, and that's one of the reasons I mentor for Christians in the media, because there have been key people in my early life. If they hadn't have mentored and supported and encouraged me, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I feel like now is time for me to do that for other people,
That's amazing.
back along the same sort of journey.
Yeah.
And yes, it's a very different world now, particularly the world of broadcasting.
How do you feel that journalism, from when you have kind of been in kind of like the kind of peak of your career, how has it changed over time in your view? What do you notice in terms of the differences between journalism then and the journalism you're seeing kind of existing now?
Yeah. Well, I did a lecture for the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity in February 2021. It's online, and it's called Fake News, Lies and Videotape. And it was my sort of attempt to try and talk to people about fake news. Now, I think people have got, that's now over 2.5 years ago. I think a lot more people in the last year or couple of years have become more aware of fake news, but it's a reality. It's studies that have been done at American University. I think it was Stanford or it might have been MIT. They prove that fake news travels 6 times as fast as real news, true news.
Wow.
And so when you think about that and the implications of that, and again, there's this whole thing about clickbait journalism where you can, I see it all the time still. You look on a page, you're reading a news article, and then down below there's an ad with a funny looking face of, say, William and Kate or Meghan, and there's some little headline, look what Kate said or whatever. And that's actually, that's been manufactured somewhere, probably in a country like Moldova. And it's not, it's not a real advert. It's just designed to make you click on a link. And learning about, what's been going on in terms of how the digital news space has really been misused by governments, by corporates, by politicians, by so many people it's been used to try and spread and sow disinformation. And so coming back to my 12-year-old self, what I want to do is give people all the relevant, right information to enable people to make wise decisions. What we're seeing is people picking up irrelevant, false information. No wonder people are making bad decisions. And I kind of keep an eye on the ecosystem, if you like. And I'm very aware that people are kind of realizing there's a problem, but they're not always sure how to, what the solution is, as it were. So coming back to your question, I think there's a lot about my BBC DNA and train. I sometimes say to me, I've got this DNA right through me, and it's the BBC training I had, in let's face it, in the early 80s and into the 90s. And I see so much of what's happening, even among the mainstream media, sometimes people not going back to basic verification. How do you know what you know? Who was the eyewitness? Who's actually the originator of this, story, whatever. And people just not, again, I have a lot of sympathy for the journalists, because they are being required to put out more and more stories with fewer and fewer people, faster and faster. They don't have the luxury often of checking things. And, if the opposition is gone with the story, they feel compelled to go with it themselves, even though they might not feel comfortable. So I see all of those things. And my summing up, and I'm not the only one to say this, colleagues of mine at the BBC 10 years ago were saying this. The digital ecosystem of journalism is actually broken, but the problem is it's kind of too developed for us to. We can't really kind of go back to square one
and undo it. Yes, yeah.
So we keep trying to kind of have, patch repairs, as it were, and
putting band-aids on something. It just feels like putting out fires from the way that you've described it, rather than can we deal with root issues. And what you raise is just so important, and it goes beautifully with kind of the next kind of direction that I wanted to ask you about, is in seeing this development and seeing how actually what this does is it puts pressure on the idea and compromise on the element of integrity within good journalism. How have you found navigating that space over time, seeing it actually becoming more and more of a pressure point? As you say, less people, more competition, more demand. And because of that pressure, it's creating space for the vulnerability of where people are not always going to get everything correct, or we're exposed to delivering news or presentations in the media that are not always overly accurate. How have you found navigating that?
Well, I mean, I think it's been over a long period of time, and I just would give you one example because it's a very fresh one. Is on Monday I was doing some media training with some Christian NGO charities in Bournemouth, and I'm just trying to think. Hang on, I've now gone a bit of a blank. About navigating it. Oh yes, and they were saying, I remember, that it's now a case of, on local newspapers, you can more or less write a press release and the local newspaper will just publish it word for word, because they don't have the staff. And this is what we've seen. We've seen a decimation of journalists coming through local newspapers, up through the local stations like I did at Radio Solent back in the 80s. And so that the lack of training, of opportunity, to really kind of learn how to check stories, that luxury is not there. And so, of course, they want to fill, they've got space to fill, they've got airtime to fill. So they just take a press release and they just publish it as it is. That we would never have ever have done that. And yet now, you realize that is increasingly a kind of what's what I want, a de facto way of operating. So of course, people will just exploit that. Whatever message they want to get into the media, they'll just be able to do that, because there's no journalist who has the time to say, hang on a minute, like, what about just double checking, or what about having another voice, or what about the opposition, what do they say about this? It'll just go in as it is. So we're all, and I think this is very strong, as we know, in the American ecosystem. People will have their media according to their politics. They'll just watch or listen to or read, the kind of the outlets they think are the ones that are telling them what they want to hear too often. And although I'm not saying the BBC is without its faults, or sometimes I see things happening in the way the BBC is developing, partly again because of funding pressures. But I do think other countries have, if you lose what we have, we still have public service broadcasting, which aims to be one voice for everybody, for the country, whether you are this way politically aligned or another way politically aligned. It's not like you've got kind of two ecosystems or two kind of echo chambers, and you hear one and then you can't believe that the other one is telling you a completely opposite story, if that makes sense. At least we have we still do have the privilege of a national conversation going on, not just the BBC, but Channel 4, Channel 4 News.
There's varied input there, for sure.
Times Radio is another one, GB News. We do have a range of outlets which try to cover all voices and all shades of opinion, really.
That's so fascinating. It's been an absolute pleasure having your insight today, Julia. Thank you so much. And as we're kind of drawing to a bit of a close to our conversation today, what form of advice, or just a piece of advice, you would share for others who are trying to navigate or get into the journalism space right now? What would be a piece of advice that you'd want to leave them with?
Well, actually, I I sometimes laugh and say to people, I think you've got to have the skin of a rhinoceros. I really do, and you have to. One of my other phrases, you have to be able to sort of swim in the piranha tank sometimes. But I also think you have to be, this favorite buzzword, very resilient, and you have to be able to take rejection. I often would say to people, I could wallpaper certainly a one room of my house, if not my whole house, with my rejection letters. The number of times I applied for jobs or opportunities that I didn't get, or I was very close to getting but didn't get. And you just have to be able to be very, if you're determined and you really want to become a journalist, you have to put up with that. But at the same time, I think, it is, I would argue, far from the way people are described, it is a really honorable calling. We are called to, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, the life. We are called to report the truth, however uncomfortable or difficult that may be at some times. And I think that this is, when you see really strong journalism coming out, an example comes to mind at the moment. There's a young man called Tristan Kirk, I think it is, who's just been revealing. You remember the case of the man who has been freed after being falsely convicted. How long did he spend in prison? Was it something like 18 years? And then he was asked to pay for his accommodation while he had been falsely imprisoned. When you see journalism sort of uncovering situations like that, or the way that, elder people are being abused in care homes, or whatever it is, when you see good, strong journalism shining light into dark places, you think, this is what I want to be part of.
Wow. Julia, this has been incredible. And I know that anybody that comes across this conversation and hearing just how enriching your experience and your life has just been, in terms of both a woman and also a Christian woman, and also someone that is just passionate about truth and feels such a compelled motivation to make sure that is part of my calling, what I need to do here. Part of my faith and conviction is to be part of that voice. It's been so encouraging today. I want to thank you so much for joining us and wishing you all of the best on your next endeavors. Thank you so much for being with us today, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Carla. It's been great to talk. God bless.
You've been listening to Faith in Media with Carla Adebekun. Make sure you catch our episodes and hit subscribe. Please share and leave us a comment. Christians in Media is a UK charity that supports, encourages, and inspires Christians from across the ever-changing media landscape. Find out more at www.christiansinmedia.co.uk and connect with us via our socials.